My name is Daniel Marsh. I've spent 20 years reporting on national security, and I've never seen anything like what I'm about to tell you. The names have been changed, but every twist in this story has its roots in reality. This is Signal Lost. March 15th, 2025. Washington, D.C. A cold Tuesday morning with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. The kind of cold that makes you wonder if spring will ever come. Eliza Morgan was halfway through her second cup of coffee in her Georgetown apartment when her phone buzzed. Just another notification in a day full of them. The endless digital river that flows through all our lives. But this one was different. An unknown number had added her to a Signal chat group labeled Operation Sandstorm. Her first instinct was to delete it, probably some crypto scammers or marketing ploy. But then her eyes caught on the participants. Secretary of Defense DNI, V. POTUS, CENTCOM, JSOC, and a dozen other government acronyms that shouldn't be visible to a national security reporter at the Capitol Tribune, no matter how well connected she was. The blood drained from her face as messages began appearing in real time. Coordinates, timelines, weapons payloads, target assessments, collateral damage projections. It was immediately, horrifyingly clear she was witnessing senior government officials discussing an imminent military operation targeting insurgent cells in Yemen. The operation involved precision strikes on weapons depots and command centers. The timeline indicated less than 24 hours until execution. I've known Eliza for years. We came up together covering the Pentagon beat during the last administration. She's not easily rattled. This is a woman who's reported from active war zones in 3 countries, and once continued an interview while mortar fire landed less than a mile away. But when she called me that morning, her voice had an edge I'd never heard before. A tight, controlled panic. "Daniel, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you," she said. She described the Signal group, reading me snippets of messages that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Information that would be classified at the highest levels, flowing across a commercial messaging app. "I don't know what to do," she told me, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If I alert them, I lose the story. If I say nothing, and people die because of this breach, I couldn't live with myself." The ethical calculus of journalism is rarely this stark. A story this explosive could define a career, or end one. It could save lives, or cost them. Decisions that usually take place in abstract discussions in journalism ethics classes were suddenly life-and-death reality. "How certain are you it's legitimate?" I asked her. "That's just it, I'm not. Part of me thinks this has to be some elaborate hoax. But the level of detail, the casual shorthand between participants, the references to previous meetings and decisions, it feels authentic." While Eliza deliberated in her Georgetown apartment, across town in the West Wing, National Security Advisor Colonel James Reynolds was congratulating himself on his innovative approach to government operations. Reynolds had created the Signal chat to streamline final coordination for Operation Sandstorm. A decorated combat veteran with 2 silver stars and a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic red tape, Reynolds had transitioned from battlefield commander to political operator with the same aggressive efficiency that had once made him a legendary special forces leader. He prided himself on running a tight ship and dragging military operations into the digital age. "Warfare doesn't wait for paperwork," was his unofficial motto, one he'd repeated so often that his staff had it printed on an ironic office birthday cake last month. His deputy, Meera Patel, had argued against the Signal group with the kind of quiet, persistent logic that made her invaluable as his second-in-command. I've interviewed Meera twice since these events unfolded. She's precisely the kind of careful, methodical intelligence professional you hope is working behind the scenes. Brilliant, meticulous, and perpetually worried about what could go wrong. She had serious concerns about using Signal for anything beyond scheduling coffee meetings. "Sir, there are established secure channels for this kind of operational planning," she had reminded Reynolds that morning, standing in his office with her arms folded across her chest. her posture communicating what her carefully neutral tone did not. Reynolds glanced up from his phone, the blue light reflecting off his wire-rimmed glasses. At 52, his once black hair had gone silver at the temples, giving him the distinguished look of a man who made difficult decisions with ease. "Those secure channels require everyone to be in a SCIF," Reynolds replied, referring to the sensitive compartmented information facilities, where classified discussions typically occur. "The Vice President is at his residence. The Secretary of Defense is at the Pentagon. The CIA Director is at Langley. I need them all engaged in real time." "Sir, with respect, the Russians use Signal. The Israelis use it. Half of Congress uses it. The encryption is military grade. We're just being efficient." He punctuated this with a dismissive wave of his hand. The conversation was over. Mira's mouth tightened into a thin line. She'd made her objection. It was documented. That would have to be enough. Efficiency. That word would come back to haunt him. What neither Reynolds nor Eliza knew was that someone else was already in the chat. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who understood exactly the value of what they were seeing. As the morning progressed, operational details continued flowing through the chat. The Secretary of Defense, Peter Garrison, a former Marine Corps general with presidential ambitions of his own, weighed in on munitions selections. "Recommend we swap the GBU-39s for GBU-53s on the secondary targets. Better penetration for the hardened facilities." The Vice President, William Harlow, asked pointed questions about collateral damage assessments. "Civilian casualty projections still too high for Site C. Need alternatives that keep numbers below threshold." The CIA Director, Elizabeth Chen, confirmed intelligence on target locations, adding details about guard rotations and local tribal politics that could impact the operation's success. Each message increasing the potential damage of the breach. Eliza watched this unfold on her phone while pacing her apartment, occasionally stopping to take notes or screenshot particularly alarming exchanges. The journalist in her recognized this as the story of a lifetime, unprecedented access to the unfiltered decision-making process behind a military strike. The citizen in her was horrified by the casual disregard for basic security protocols. By noon, Eliza made her decision. She would monitor the chat silently, but would not publish until after the operation. American lives were at stake, and despite the journalistic coup in her hands, some lines couldn't be crossed. She called her editor at the Tribune, giving him a carefully worded heads-up that a major national security story was brewing, without revealing her source. "How reliable is this information?" he asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. "If it's real, it's the biggest security breach I've ever seen," she replied, choosing her words with extreme care, conscious that her cell phone was far from secure. "If it's not real, someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create an elaborate hoax. Either way, it's a story." "Keep me posted," he said. "And Eliza, be careful." Those words would prove prophetic. Throughout the afternoon, Eliza saved screenshots, recorded timestamps, and began building a timeline of the decision-making process she was witnessing. In less than 24 hours, she would have the story of her career. But in her focus on the ethical implications and documentation, she missed subtle anomalies in the chat. Certain messages from the account labeled DNI Harris used distinctly different sentence structures at different times. Questions were posed and then seemingly answered by the same person minutes later. Small inconsistencies that might mean nothing to a casual observer, but would have set alarm bells ringing for anyone trained in counterintelligence. At 3:17 p.m., a message appeared from DNI Harris that particularly stood out. "Confirm weather conditions for operation window?" 17 minutes later, the same account posted, "Weather forecast shows optimal conditions during the operation window." A question and its answer from the same person, a minor slip in an otherwise meticulously orchestrated deception. But Eliza, consumed with the larger ethical dilemma, didn't notice. As afternoon faded into evening, Reynolds received a call from the president while walking to his car in the White House parking garage. The garage was one of the few places in the complex where he could speak freely without staff or visitors overhearing sensitive conversations. The echoing concrete space with its smell of exhaust and floor cleaner had become an unofficial extension of his office for the most sensitive calls. "It's a go," the president told him, his voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Full authorization. Make it clean." "Understood, sir. We'll execute as planned." Reynolds ended the call and leaned against his government-issued Suburban for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle across his shoulders. For all his bravado about efficiency and cutting red tape, he understood the gravity of what they were about to do. American forces would cross sovereign borders. Weapons would be deployed. People would die. If it went wrong, the consequences would be severe, diplomatically, militarily, politically. He pulled out his phone and opened Signal. With absurd casualness, considering the gravity of the action, he sent a thumbs-up emoji to the group, the digital equivalent of an order that would soon send precision-guided munitions into targets halfway around the world. Eliza watched this unfold on her phone while sitting in her darkened apartment, the blue light of her screen illuminating her face. She was the invisible observer to history in real time. What she didn't yet realize was that she wasn't the only one watching. In a nondescript office building in downtown Dubai, 3 floors above a busy mobile phone shop and 2 floors below a multinational consulting firm, a man we'll call Hassan observed the same messages. The room was sparse: a desk, 3 monitors, an elaborate cooling system for the computers, and little else. Unlike Eliza, he had no ethical qualms about how to use this information. He had been watching the chat for 17 hours, ever since their cyber team had managed to compromise one of the participants' phones through a sophisticated spear phishing operation. Hassan's face remained impassive as he read Reynolds' thumbs-up emoji, understanding immediately what it signified. He picked up a secure phone, not Signal, ironically enough, and dialed a number from memory. "It's confirmed," he said simply. "Operation proceeding as scheduled. I have all the details." He ended the call and began copying specific coordinates and timing information from the chat into an encrypted document. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, a man who had done this kind of work before. When he finished, he sent the document through a series of proxy servers that would make it almost impossible to trace. The opening moves were made, the pieces were in motion, and the consequences would be devastating. "8,000 miles away from Washington, Captain Maya Santiago checked her equipment one final time in the dim light of a forward operating base in Saudi Arabia. At 34, she had already served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Syria. Her reputation for calm, methodical leadership had earned her command of one of the most elite special operations teams in the military. The team had been briefed on their mission just hours earlier, gathering in a secure tent with paper maps and satellite imagery. The intelligence was unusually specific: precise locations, guard rotations, even the brand of locks on the compound doors. "This is the best intel I've ever seen for an op," her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Wade, remarked as they reviewed the mission parameters. At 29, Wade had the lean, coiled energy of a natural athlete and the cautious eyes of someone who had seen combat go wrong too many times to trust in perfect plans. Almost suspiciously good. "Let's hope it's accurate," Santiago replied, her voice betraying nothing of the subtle unease that had been growing since the briefing. Something about the intelligence felt too perfect, too convenient. In her experience, information this comprehensive usually came with caveats and uncertainties. This had none. She dismissed the thought as pre-mission jitters. Every operator felt them, no matter how experienced. The trick was to acknowledge the feeling without letting it cloud your judgment. She had a job to do, and she would do it with the same precision and professionalism she always brought to her work. Santiago looked around at her team as they made their final preparations. 6 men and 2 women, each selected for their specific skills and temperament. They had trained together, fought together, trusted each other with their lives. Whatever happened in the next 12 hours, they would face it as a unit. 90 minutes to wheels up, she announced. Final checks now. The intelligence was accurate, perfectly so, and that should have been the first warning. Back in Washington, as midnight approached, Meera Patel was still at her desk in the White House, the overhead fluorescent lights giving her olive skin a sickly pallor. The building had largely emptied, with only security personnel and a skeleton staff remaining. She preferred working late. The quiet allowed her to think, to catch details that might be missed in the chaotic energy of the workday. Something about the signal group had been nagging at her all day, a persistent itch at the back of her mind that she couldn't quite scratch. Following her instinct, she pulled up the group's creation logs, scanning the list of numbers Reynolds had added. And there it was, an anomaly. When Reynolds had created the chat, he had added a number that matched none of their stored contacts. A simple typo, perhaps. A wrong digit entered in haste. The kind of minor human error that happens 1,000 times a day in Washington without consequence. But this wasn't without consequence. Not for communications at this level. She ran the number through their secure database. No matches in their contact system. She tried reverse lookup services. Nothing. Finally, she used a specialized tool available only to senior intelligence officials to trace the phone's purchase history. The results sent a chill through her body. A burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Adams Morgan 3 days earlier. The store had security cameras, but without a warrant, she couldn't access the footage. Even if she could, 3 days was plenty of time for the footage to have been overwritten in a small business's security system. Meera immediately tried calling Reynolds, but the call went straight to voicemail. She knew he had already taken a sleeping pill and turned off his phone. Tomorrow would be a high-stress day, and he needed to be sharp. That was his routine. Medications at 10, phone off at 10:15, lights out by 10:30. The disciplined schedule of a military man. She considered calling his home landline or sending someone to his house, but hesitated. Was this enough evidence to wake the National Security Advisor in the middle of the night? A wrong number could be just that. A simple mistake. There was no proof of compromise, just an anomaly that warranted investigation. Meera stared at her computer screen, a sense of unease growing in her stomach. She drafted an urgent message to Reynolds, explaining her findings and recommending immediate suspension of all communications through the signal group. Her finger hovered over the send button. What if she was overreacting? Reynolds already viewed her as excessively cautious. If she woke him for what turned out to be nothing, it would damage her credibility when she needed to raise legitimate concerns in the future. The operation was already in motion. The teams were deployed. Changing communication channels now could create confusion that might endanger the mission. In that moment of hesitation lay the seeds of disaster. She decided to send a more measured message instead, flagging the anomaly for investigation first thing in the morning, before the operation reached its critical phase. She would also implement additional monitoring protocols for the signal group without alarming the participants. It was a reasonable compromise. A professional judgment call. It was also, as she would soon learn, catastrophically wrong. As the first light of dawn broke over Washington, painting the Potomac in shades of pink and gold, Operation Sandstorm was already in motion. In Yemen, Captain Santiago's team was moving into position. In the White House Situation Room, officials gathered to monitor the operation. And on Signal, messages continued to flow. Status updates, position confirmations, go orders. Reynolds arrived at the White House at 5:30 a.m., having slept soundly thanks to his prescription. He briefly checked his messages, including Meera's flag about the unknown number, but with the operation already active, he filed it away as something to address after the mission concluded. A potential security issue, yes, but not an immediate concern. In the Situation Room, officials from various agencies assembled around the iconic long table, coffee cups and briefing materials arranged before them. Multiple screens displayed satellite imagery, drone feeds, and status updates. The atmosphere was tense, but controlled, the practiced calm of people who had overseen similar operations before. The Secretary of Defense checked his phone, where the signal group showed Santiago's team was in their final approach. He gave Reynolds a nod. Everything proceeding according to plan. Eliza watched it all unfold from her apartment, screenshot by screenshot, message by message. The invisible witness to decisions that would soon be scrutinized by history. She had called in sick to work, unwilling to leave her phone or miss any developments. The weight of what she was witnessing pressed down on her chest like a physical force. The power to potentially save lives or jeopardize an operation. All in her hands because of someone's careless mistake. Unknown to everyone in Washington, the mistake had already borne deadly fruit. In Yemen, Captain Santiago led her team through the pre-dawn darkness toward their objective, a compound supposedly housing high-level insurgent leaders and weapon stockpiles. The night vision gave the landscape an eerie green glow, transforming the rocky terrain into an alien world. Santiago moved with practiced stealth, every sense heightened, alert for any sign of danger. But something felt wrong. The approach had been too easy. The outlying areas they'd expected to be patrolled were deserted. The security measures detailed in their intelligence briefing were absent. "I don't like this," Lieutenant Wade whispered, his voice barely audible over their secure comms. "Where is everyone?" Santiago felt the same creeping dread, but the mission parameters were clear. They had to confirm the target's presence and secure the weapons cache. "Maintain formation," she ordered. "Proceed with extreme caution." They moved toward the central building, covering each other in the practiced dance of a well-trained unit. Still no resistance, no guards, no motion sensors, nothing. Santiago's instincts screamed at her to abort, to get her people out, but the intelligence had been specific. The targets were here. The mission was authorized at the highest levels. Withdrawing without confirmation would be a dereliction of duty. She gave the hand signal to breach the main entrance. That's when everything went to hell. The first explosion came from their left flank. Not from the building, but from a ridge they'd already cleared and secured. The second and third blasts followed almost immediately, boxing them in with walls of fire and shrapnel. Precision mortar fire began raining down, each shell landing with uncanny accuracy. This wasn't an ambush, it was an execution. "Fall back!" Santiago screamed into her comm, already moving to drag an injured team member toward what little cover existed. "It's a trap!" In the chaos that followed, her training took over. Identify the nearest threat. Eliminate it if possible. Find an exit route. Protect the wounded. The rhythmic discipline of combat kept the panic at bay, even as she registered the horrifying truth. Someone had given their enemy every detail of their operation. The first shots were fired at 0547 local time. By 0600, 4 of her 8-person team were dead. Santiago herself had taken shrapnel in her left shoulder and leg. She and 2 others were pinned down in a shallow drainage ditch, surrounded by enemy combatants who seemed to know their exact position, equipment capabilities, and tactical doctrine. The mission hadn't just failed. It had been designed to fail from the start. In Washington, the first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when Santiago's locator beacon went offline. One moment it was transmitting movement data, the next, nothing. The same happened with 3 other team members in rapid succession. The drone feed showed muzzle flashes and explosions, but couldn't penetrate the smoke to show what was happening on the ground. Frantic attempts to establish communications yielded nothing but static. In the Situation Room, the atmosphere transformed from confident tension to barely controlled panic. The Secretary of Defense barked orders for immediate extraction options. Military liaisons frantically coordinated with assets in the region. Reynolds stood frozen, his face ashen, as the magnitude of the disaster became clear. "What the hell happened?" the president demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "How did they know we were coming?" No one had an answer. At least, not yet. As news of the ambush reached the Situation Room via secure channels, the blood drained from Reynolds' face. The president demanded answers. How could the enemy have been so prepared? How could they have known exactly where and when the team would arrive? Reynolds maintained his composure, blaming faulty intelligence rather than acknowledging the possibility of a communication breach. The alternative was unthinkable. That his decision to use signal for convenience had just cost American lives. But Mira knew. The moment she heard about the ambush, the pieces clicked into place. The unknown number, the burner phone, the too perfect intelligence. She pulled Reynolds aside, her voice low and urgent. "Sir, I think the signal group was compromised." Reynolds stared at her, the implications washing over him in a cold wave of realization. If she was right, this wasn't just a tactical failure. It was negligence. Criminal negligence. The kind that ended careers and might even lead to charges. "We need to contain this," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Lock down all communications. Full investigation. No one discusses this outside this room." But it was already too late for containment. Eliza had been documenting everything. In her apartment, Eliza watched in horror as fragments of information about the failed mission began appearing in the signal chat. Terse updates, demands for extraction plans, accusations about intelligence failure. The human tragedy behind the sterile language was all too clear to her experienced eye. She had a decision to make. The story she'd been monitoring had just become much bigger and far deadlier than she'd anticipated. American personnel were dead or captured. The public deserved to know why. But publishing now could compromise rescue efforts and further endanger those still alive. Her ethical dilemma had just become infinitely more complex. Meanwhile, in an undisclosed location in Yemen, Captain Santiago regained consciousness in a darkened room that smelled of dust and old blood. Her equipment was gone. Her wounds had been roughly bandaged. Through the fog of pain and disorientation, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had provided their operational details to the enemy with enough precision to set this perfect trap. If she survived, she would find out who, and they would pay. The ghost in the chat had done its work. The damage was done, and the hunt for accountability was about to begin. The question now wasn't just who was responsible, but how high the price would be, and who would ultimately pay it.
Signal Lost is a production of Calaroga Shark Media. Executive producers Mark Francis and John McDermott. The assistance of AI was used in the production of this show.